Loneliness does not always arrive loudly. Sometimes it settles quietly between two people who once believed love alone would be enough. My name is Ethan, and for nearly 4 years, Mark had been my home. We shared an apartment, routines, and memories that looked solid from the outside. But lately, our life together felt like a paused conversation neither of us knew how to restart. Mark was not cruel or careless. If anything, he was responsible, focused, and ambitious. His days revolved around deadlines, meetings, and plans for a future he believed we were building together. Yet somewhere along the way, I stopped feeling included in that future. Our evenings became silent meals and glowing phone screens. When I spoke, he listened politely, but not deeply. I missed being seen without having to explain myself. That I told myself it was just a phase. Relationships evolve, people change, and love requires patience. Still, the quiet inside me kept growing. I began to feel lonely even when Mark was sitting right beside me, and that kind of loneliness is the hardest to admit. That was when I started going to the community pool. At first, it was simply an excuse to leave the apartment. The pool was calm in the late afternoons, filled with sunlight and soft echoes of splashing water. It gave me space to breathe, to exist without expectations. In the water, my thoughts slowed down, and for a brief while, the heaviness in my chest loosened its grip. One afternoon, as I rested near the edge of the pool, I noticed Ryan. He wasn't loud or attention-seeking. He had an easy presence, the kind that made silence feel comfortable rather than awkward. When our eyes met, he smiled, not the practiced kind, but something warm and unguarded. "Rough day?" he asked casually. I hesitated before answering, surprised by how natural the question felt. "Something like that," I replied. That was all it took to start a conversation. We spoke about small things at first: the heat, the quiet hours of the pool, how coming there felt like stepping out of real life for a moment. Ryan listened closely, nodding, asking questions that showed he genuinely cared about the answers. I realized how long it had been since someone had listened to me that way. Over the next few days, our conversations became a routine. We didn't exchange numbers or make plans. We simply talked when we happened to be there at the same time. Ryan shared that he worked freelance and liked places where people weren't rushing to be someone else. There was an honesty in the way he spoke that made me feel safe, even though we barely knew each other. What unsettled me was how much I looked forward to those brief moments. At home, Mark and I continued moving around each other carefully, like we were both afraid of breaking something fragile. I wanted to tell him about the pool, about how peaceful it felt, but I didn't. Not because I was hiding anything specific, but because I feared admitting how empty I felt. Saying it out loud might make it real. Each time I returned to the pool, I felt lighter. Ryan never pushed, never crossed a line. Still, there was a quiet understanding between us, an unspoken recognition of shared solitude. I caught myself thinking about things I wanted to tell him before I even arrived. That realization brought a sharp sting of guilt. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the water in shades of gold, Ryan said, "You seem like someone who carries a lot without letting it show." The word struck deeper than I expected. I laughed it off, but inside, something shifted. He had seen me, not the version of me trying to be fine, but the truth beneath it. When I got home that night, Mark was already asleep. I stood in the doorway for a long moment, watching him breathe, wondering when we had stopped talking about what mattered. I loved him, I truly did, but love alone wasn't filling the silence anymore. As I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, one thought refused to leave my mind. I hadn't done anything wrong, at least not yet. But for the first time, I understood how easily loneliness could open a door you never intended to walk through, and I wasn't sure I had the strength to close it. What began as coincidence soon settled into expectation. I no longer went to the pool simply to swim. I went because a part of me hoped Ryan would be there. I told myself it was harmless, that companionship did not automatically mean betrayal. Still, each time I checked the time before leaving the apartment, I felt the quiet weight of intention behind my steps. Ryan and I talked more freely now. The conversations grew layered, unfolding beyond surface details into stories that revealed who we were when no one was watching. He spoke about a past relationship that had ended not with anger, but with exhaustion. "We stopped choosing each other," he said once, his voice steady but distant. I understood him more than I wanted to admit that I noticed how easily words came to me around him. I spoke about my work, my doubts, even my fear of becoming invisible in my own life. Ryan never rushed to fix anything. He listened, and that alone felt powerful. It reminded me of a version of myself that used to speak openly, without measuring every sentence. At home, the silence with Mark felt heavier by contrast. He wasn't cold, just distracted. He asked about my day, but his mind often wandered before I finished answering. I began offering shorter replies, saving my real thoughts for the quiet moments by the pool. That choice unsettled me more than I expected. One evening, Mark mentioned an upcoming work trip and suggested we celebrate beforehand with dinner. His effort was sincere, and guilt tightened in my chest. I nodded, smiled, and agreed, wondering when I had started feeling like I was living two emotional lives. The pool remained our unspoken refuge. One afternoon, a sudden rainstorm forced everyone inside, leaving Ryan and me sitting near the windows, watching the water ripple under the gray sky. The closeness felt different then, more intimate, more charged. There was a pause between us, thick with things neither of us said. "I get the feeling you're standing at a crossroads," Ryan said quietly. That I looked at him, startled by the accuracy of his words. "Maybe," I replied. "Or maybe I'm just tired of pretending I'm not lost." He nodded, as if that answer completed a thought he'd already had. There was understanding in his eyes, but also restraint. That restraint mattered. It was the boundary keeping everything from tipping too far, even as the ground beneath us shifted. That night, I lay awake beside Mark, replaying the day in my mind. I hadn't touched Ryan. I hadn't confessed anything. Yet my heart felt divided in a way I couldn't ignore. Emotional honesty, I realized, could be as dangerous as secrecy when shared with the wrong person. The distance between Mark and me grew subtle but undeniable. We still laughed occasionally, still shared space, but something essential had thinned. I noticed how often I checked my phone, hoping for a message that never came because we had never exchanged numbers. The absence itself became a presence, shaping my thoughts. When Mark finally asked if something was bothering me, I nearly told him everything. The words pressed against my chest, desperate to escape. But fear stopped me, fear of hurting him, fear of confronting the truth, fear of what might change if I spoke honestly. I told him I was just tired. He accepted the answer too easily, and that hurt more than if he had pushed. At the pool the next day, Ryan sensed the shift in me immediately. "You don't look okay," he said. "I'm not," I admitted. The simplicity of the confession surprised us both. We sat in silence, the water lapping softly nearby. For a moment, I felt an urge to close the distance between us, to seek comfort without consequences. Instead, I stayed still, my hands clenched, my thoughts racing. This was the moment I had been avoiding, the moment where intention mattered more than circumstance. "I should go," I said finally, standing up before hesitation could weaken my resolve. Ryan didn't argue. "Whatever you decide," he said, "make sure it's something you can live with." As I walked away, his words echoed louder than the sound of the pool behind me. I knew then that pretending nothing was happening was no longer an option. I was standing on the edge of a truth that demanded acknowledgement. That I hadn't crossed a visible line, but the invisible one lay shattered at my feet. And soon, I would have to decide whether to step back, or keep moving forward, no matter the cost. The tension I carried finally demanded a voice. It surfaced one quiet evening when Mark and I sat across from each other at the kitchen table, the space between us filled with words we had both been avoiding. He looked tired, not from work, but from distance. That was when I understood how visible my silence had become. "You've been somewhere else lately," Mark said, his tone calm but weighted. "I don't mean physically." I took a slow breath, realizing there was no safe way around the truth. "I've been lonely," I admitted. "Even when I'm with you." The confession hung in the air, fragile and irreversible. Mark leaned back, processing, not angry, just hurt. He asked questions gently, as if he were afraid of pushing me further away. I told him about the pool, about finding quiet there, and finally about Ryan. I was careful with my words, not to minimize my choices, but not to exaggerate them either. I didn't touch him, I said. But I let myself feel understood by someone else. Mark closed his eyes for a moment. When he opened them, there was disappointment, but also honesty. "Do you know how much that hurts?" he asked. "Not because you talked to someone, but because you stopped talking to me." That truth cut deeper than accusation. We sat there, stripped of excuses, facing the version of ourselves we had neglected. Mark admitted that he had buried himself in work to avoid dealing with his own fears about the future. He had assumed stability meant silence, that comfort didn't require constant attention. Hearing that didn't erase the damage, but it gave it context. For the first time in months, we spoke without defensiveness. We talked about expectations, about how love could erode quietly if left unattended. There was no dramatic ultimatum, only the slow realization that something had to change. The next day, I went to the pool knowing it might be the last time I did so for reasons beyond swimming. Ryan was there, sitting in the familiar spot, his posture relaxed but his eyes searching my face. He sensed the shift immediately. I told him, I said before he could speak. Ryan nodded, absorbing the weight of my words. "And how did that go?" "Hard," I replied. "Necessary." We didn't dance around the truth. I told him that what we shared, though never physical, had crossed a line I couldn't pretend didn't exist. Ryan listened, his expression thoughtful rather than defensive. He admitted that he, too, had felt the pull, the temptation to become something more simply because it felt easy. "I don't want to be someone's escape," he said quietly. Neither did I. That realization brought a strange sense of relief. We agreed to step back, to let what existed between us end with honesty rather than regret. There was sadness in that goodbye, but also respect. Some connections are meant to reveal truths, not become destinations. At home, Mark and I began the slow work of repair. There were no instant solutions, only effort. We set aside time to talk without distractions, to listen without preparing defenses. Trust did not return overnight, but intention did, and that felt like a beginning. Still, uncertainty lingered. We both understood that choosing each other again would require consistency, not promises. I wondered if we were strong enough to rebuild what had thinned over time, or if this honesty would eventually lead us in separate directions. One night, as Mark slept beside me, I reflected on how close I had come to losing something without fully understanding why. Loneliness, I learned, does not excuse betrayal, but it does demand attention. Ignoring it only allows it to grow quietly destructive. I did not know what the future held for Mark and me. Healing is not linear, and love does not guarantee permanence. But I knew this much: I had stopped running from the truth. I had chosen to face it, even when it cost me comfort. As I closed my eyes, the image of the pool faded from my mind, replaced by a deeper awareness of myself. Whatever came next would be shaped not by escape, but by honesty, and that, for the first time in a long while, felt like solid ground. Time did not rush to heal what honesty had uncovered. In the days that followed, Mark and I moved carefully, as if relearning the shape of each other's presence. Conversations were slower, more deliberate. We spoke with intention now, choosing clarity over comfort, even when the truth felt awkward or incomplete. Mark suggested counseling, not as a final attempt, but as a shared responsibility. His willingness surprised me, not because it was dramatic, but because it was steady. I agreed, recognizing that effort mattered more than reassurance. Love, I was learning, was sustained by attention, not assumption. Despite the progress, uncertainty remained. Some evenings felt hopeful, filled with warmth and rediscovery. Others were quiet and heavy, shadowed by doubt. I noticed how easily fear could return, whispering that repair might only delay an inevitable ending. Instead of silencing it, I began acknowledging it, letting it exist without letting it decide for me. I stopped going to the pool. The absence felt strange at first, like stepping away from a place where a version of myself had briefly found relief. Yet with distance came clarity. Ryan had never been the problem, he had been the mirror. Through him, I had seen what I was missing and what I had failed to ask for. That realization carried gratitude rather than regret. One afternoon, Mark and I took a walk through the city, talking about small things, music, memories, plans we had postponed too long. There was laughter, cautious but genuine. As we walked, I realized how rarely we had simply shared space without distraction. The simplicity of it felt grounding. "I don't expect things to be perfect," Mark said, breaking the comfortable silence. "I just want us to keep choosing honesty." I nodded, knowing how difficult that promise could be to keep. Honesty required vulnerability, and vulnerability demanded courage. Still, it felt like a commitment worth making, even if the outcome remained uncertain. At night, I reflected on how close I had come to losing myself while searching for relief from loneliness. I understood now that escape rarely offers answers, it only postpones questions. The pool had given me quiet, Ryan had given me understanding, but neither could replace the work of facing my own needs openly. Mark and I were not the same as we had been before. Something had shifted permanently. Yet change did not always mean loss. Sometimes it meant growth, even if that growth came with discomfort. I allowed myself to accept that whatever direction our relationship took, it would be shaped by intention rather than avoidance. Weeks later, as I stood alone on our balcony, watching the city lights flicker below, I felt a calm that had nothing to do with certainty. I didn't know whether Mark and I would last forever. I didn't know what challenges waited ahead. What I did know was that I had stopped running from myself. Loneliness had led me to the edge of a choice, but honesty had guided me back. Not to safety, not to guarantees, but to awareness. And awareness, I realized, was the beginning of every meaningful decision. As I turned back inside, where Mark waited with 2 cups of tea, I understood that the story wasn't ending. It was simply pausing, open to whatever truth came next.